Alright, this is Block 2, Section 5, the term list starting with spheres of influence and including extraterritoriality, John Hay and the Boxer Rebellion. Here is a map of China in 1900. China was not a colony. China had its ancient imperial government and a whole lot of European influence. And you can see by the colors. Here's China. The colors indicate spheres of influence where European imperial powers pretty much had say in China. That they were the only Europeans allowed to trade there. They were the only Europeans that Europeans could travel freely there. And there got to be things like extraterritoriality. So we're going to get to extraterritoriality in a moment. Let's take a look at some of the countries. Up along the northern border of China in this red area, this was area dominated by Russians. This little kind of maroony area over here was the German sphere of influence, and it's called a sphere of influence because it is a area, a section, could be small, could be large, where the country in question has influence. That the red, Russia, has influence over this area. It's Russia's sphere of influence. Germany has influence over this maroon area. It is its sphere of influence. The purple is the Japanese. They have a sphere of influence. You can see that not all imperialists were white Europeans. The Japanese were getting quite good at it themselves. The green was Great Britain, had several different spheres of influence, and the yellow were the French. The Portuguese also had some spheres of influence, small ones, and the small island of Macau was a Portuguese sphere of influence. So you can see that although China was technically one united country ruled by the emperor in Beijing, in reality it was controlled in large part, especially along the wealthier coasts and along the wealthier rivers, by Europeans. The spheres of influence got to be so large that the Europeans established what is known as extraterritoriality. And that's a long word with a very simple concept. What it means is if you were an English guy living in the English sphere of influence, you were subject to English laws, not Chinese laws. If you were a Frenchman living in the French sphere of influence, you were subject to French laws, not Chinese laws. So basically what that's saying is that the government in China no longer has control over its own territory. That if a British person murders somebody in the British sphere of influence, they don't go to a Chinese court. They go to a British court with British systems of judge and, jury and evidence. And that might be fine. There's nothing wrong with a British court, but there might be something wrong with a British court operating on British citizens in a foreign country. That's extraterritoriality. It means that the rules of France go in the French sphere of influence, not the rules of China. The open door policy, which was the brainchild of Secretary of State John Hay. He was McKinley's Secretary of State and then Roosevelt's Secretary of State. And he did not, all the good parts of China were carved up by the European countries. And the United States said, hey, we want a piece of this game. But the United States had no desire to carve out its own sphere of influence because you had to have an army there, you had to have a navy there, it was very expensive. The United States said, eek, we don't want to do that. We just want to do all the trading. We don't want to spend the money to have armies and navies here in China. So what Secretary Hay came up with was called the open door policy. And he basically went to all the European countries and said, hey, we should have an open door policy on trade. Whoever wants to trade in any part of China should have an open door to do so. A big, welcoming, open door in China to trade. And what Hay was, of course, talking about was Americans' ability to trade. He was afraid that these militarily powerful European countries, Britain, France, Germany, would exclude the United States. So Secretary Hay tried to open all of China up to all of the powers. That, you know what, Hay said, you know what, Britain, that's fine that you have this sphere of influence here along the Yangtze River. Usually that's the Yellow River, that's the Yangtze, that's the Yellow. It's fine that you have this sphere of influence along the Yellow River, British Empire, but everybody should be free to trade in there, not just you. And Hay was a smart guy. Secretary Hay kind of played these powerful European countries off against each other. So his open door policy worked. And American traders especially traded all throughout China in all the different spheres of influence. So that's the open door policy. Keep China open to trade with all the powers. Who did he not ask about all of this? China, which was a weak, backward, corrupt country ruled by a weak, backward, corrupt empress at the time. And they made a really good movie that has her and her son, the last emperor of China, in it. It's called The Last Emperor. All of this, the Chinese are a proud people, as right they should be. They have one of the oldest civilizations in the world. They were getting pretty pissed off that all these European countries were dominating them, had better technology, better government, better science, and they started to get mad. And in 1900, a secret Chinese society known as the Boxers, and they didn't call themselves the Boxers, the Europeans called them Boxers because their symbol was a closed fist. Let's see if we can find that. Boxer Rebellion symbol. New. That's German. Boxer Rebellion fist. See if we can. No. Not finding one easily here. In any case, the Boxers, as they were called in the West, revolted against foreigners in their midst, and they killed a whole bunch of Europeans, and they lay siege to the foreign legislation. Now, this was not the Chinese army. The Chinese army was just as freaked out about this as anybody else because it was a threat to their remaining power also. But all of the embassies in Beijing were besieged, and women and children were inside, and the soldiers were outnumbered, and these tens of thousands of Boxer rebels were outside. And this freaked out the European powers, and they sent in, for probably the only time in all of the history of the world, all of these European powers finally agreed on something, and they sent in a multinational force. And Americans were included in this multinational force. 2,500 Americans and several tens of thousands of other European soldiers were dispatched to China to relieve the siege and rescue their citizens. And these small Western armies kind of converged on Beijing, and the Chinese had nothing to stop them. Just the European technology was that much more advanced, and it defeated the Chinese Boxer forces and, dispersed them back into the countryside, and that was kind of the end of the Boxer Rebellion. Now, if you study Chinese history, what the Boxer Rebellion will turn into is the overthrow of the emperor, the establishment of the Chinese Republic, and then you soon after that had the rise of the Chinese Communists, and Chinese history is interesting, very interesting also. But for our intents and purposes, the Boxer Rebellion, all these European countries, and for the first time, including the United States becoming a world power, helps to put down this Boxer Rebellion. So that's what's going on in China at the turn of the century. America is flexing its muscles and testing itself out all around the world by 1900.